If you guys have been following professional bass fishing over the past few months, you'll have seen a lot of pros throwing jerkbaits in either brush piles or standing timber, and they're all using forward-facing sonar. Today, I came out to Table Rock Lake to show you how this pattern works and go through some of the details that you may have missed while watching these tournaments. Let's get into it. The first thing I want to get into is the type of areas the pros are targeting with these jerkbaits and forward-facing sonar. In general, they're fishing two types of cover: brush piles and standing timber. If we go to the BPT event on Lake Fork, a lot of the guys were weaving in and out of standing timber on these massive offshore flats, and they were targeting fish that were suspended in those trees. There was another Toyota Series event recently that was on Lake of the Ozarks, and guys were fishing brush piles in that event. The bass were suspended in the top of these brush piles, and guys were scanning these brush piles with their live scope or forward-facing sonar, casting jerkbaits and Alabama rigs over the top of the brush and getting those fish to commit. Now, there's a couple different ways you can actually find these standing timber areas or brush pile areas. And it all comes down to identifying which of these different types of cover is actually holding fish. The more tricky example is finding fish in standing timber. That's what I did today on Table Rock Lake. Standing timber is basically old trees that were in the lake before it was flooded, and they're literally everywhere. This whole pocket behind me, every single creek in this entire lake is just flooded with standing timber. There's literally millions of trees out here. So how do you figure out which of those trees is going to hold fish? The two ways you can do it is you can literally just drop your trolling motor, go around any points or ledges or drop-offs and scan them with your forward-facing sonar to see if there's fish in those trees. The second way is to graph them with your traditional 2D sonar and down imaging and side imaging. Both ways will allow you to identify fish, but there's definitely one way that's a lot more efficient. When I got to the lake today, I actually wanted to test out if it was better to just drop the trolling motor with the live scope and go around these points to scan the trees. But immediately after doing this for like an hour, hour and a half, I realized it was so much slower to actually graph with your live scope compared to graphing with your 2D sonar. When I was going around these points with my down imaging and 2D sonar, I was able to make 1 to 2 passes around those points, and it only took maybe a minute or two to scan each point, and I covered 90% of the water. On the other hand, it was taking me 5 to 10 minutes to scan each point with the live scope. You can just go a lot faster when you're graphing with your traditional down scan and side scan, anywhere from 4 to 5 miles an hour, compared to your live scope. My live scope's mounted on my trolling motor, which allows me to really dial in my casts and use both hands. Some guys put it on a pole, and actually have a pole mount right there that I've used before. I just don't like it, not my style. And because I have it mounted on my trolling motor, you really can only go like a mile or 2 per hour around these points. That means you're going sometimes 3 to 4 times faster on your big engine, and you're covering that much more water. You're not going to cover every single inch of the point with your down scan and your 2D sonar because the cone of that transducer isn't going to hit everything. But you can probably cover about 80% of the point, which is enough to let you know if there's fish in that area, bait fish and fish in the trees. You get 100% coverage if you're really thorough with that live scope sweeping, but it's just so much slower that that additional amount of water you're covering is not worth it compared to the amount of time you're giving up. On average, I could graph 3 points with my down imaging and side imaging in the time that I can graph 1 with the live scope. Once I determined that it was more efficient to graph with my down imaging and side imaging, I started identifying some key trees with my down scan and 2D sonar. These trees I'm showing here on the screen are, again, standing trees that are 10 to 15 feet tall, and they're in 20 to 25 feet of water. Around these trees, you can see isolated dots, or on the 2D sonar, you see these arches. These are fish, and every single time I would graph a tree and I saw a dot around there, I would drop the live scope and I would actually see more than one fish. For whatever reason, on the down scan, side scan, I would only see 1 or 2 fish per tree, but when I dropped the live scope in there, there'd be 4 or 5 fish. I don't know if that's just the angle that I was hitting the tree at or what it was, but it was very consistent in the fact that I could graph these trees, see a couple dots around them, drop the live scope, cast on them, and there'd be fish following my jerkbait. This also made me very efficient because I could mark those trees using the GPS on my fish finder, and then I could line up with them with the live scope, and instead of having to fish the entire point, I just could target those individual 2 trees that I graphed. And I definitely needed every single minute of that time I saved to actually catch the fish on this jerkbait in those standing trees. Honestly, guys, I was shocked at how hard it was to get these fish to commit to this jerkbait. The bait I was throwing today was the Megabass Vision 110 +2 jerkbait. It's a deeper diving jerkbait that dives between 8 to 10 feet deep on this 10-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon. The reason I was going with this deeper diving jerkbait is a lot of these fish were suspended in these trees in that 8 to 10 foot range, and I wanted to bring it right in front of their face. And when I mean right in front of their face, literally the only way I get these fish to commit to this jerkbait is if I brought it within a foot or two of their face on that live scope. If I couldn't see my jerkbait and the bass in the exact same image, I never got bit. And I only ended up catching 3 fish over the entire day. Part of that is because it took me so long to graph and find these trees. They're not everywhere. Even though there's a million trees out there, maybe only 1 out of 100 have fish in them. So I spent half my day just graphing. The other half of the day, I was trying to figure out how to get these fish to actually commit. And you know, when you're on that live scope, it seems easy. You can see the fish, you just cast it in there and catch them. It seems like it's really simple. But a lot of times you get these fish to actually commit on the live scope, you need that bait to be within a foot or two of their face, and then work your bait either up or down or in the perfect way to get them to commit. Most of the time, when I got it right by their face, I would twitch it one time and they would just swim away. They would swim down or swim up and they would lose interest in the bait. Very rarely though, you would have a fish that would stay interested in the bait after you jerked it. It would sit behind the bait, and I'll show you here on live scope what happens. They'll follow that bait and they'll just kind of keep with it for maybe 10-15 seconds. You'll also notice that every fish that I show here that I caught had the very back hook of my jerkbait. They weren't eating it very well. And that's partially because of the bluebird skies and no wind. Somehow I always pick the worst days to come out here. It's beautiful weather, but if we had a little bit of wind or a little bit of clouds, it probably would have helped the bite a little bit. But because of the really tough conditions, these fish were just barely getting this jerkbait, and a lot of them weren't committing at all. I probably brought my jerkbait, I would estimate, in front of 100 different fish today, and I only got 3 to commit. That is a very low percentage, a 3% commitment rate from these fish. And even if I came out here tomorrow and had all these spots marked, I had about 30 trees that I found that had fish in it, and I was able to fish all 8 hours, I still think I may only get 5 to 10 fish in the boat, just because these fish were so tough to trigger on this jerkbait. If I fish 30 trees, there's a chance that I may only catch fish off of 2 or 3 of those trees. Now, I did catch multiple fish off the same tree, so even if I only get bit on a couple trees, there's a chance I'll catch 2 or 3 fish per tree. So that's a pretty good deal. It's the same way with those brush piles a lot of times. You're gonna catch multiple fish per brush pile if they're there. So it does make sense to actually graph, find these spots, and use this pattern if you were in a tournament or wanted to go out and have a really good fishing day, because you can generate enough bites. But the key is having enough spots, and by that I mean at least 20 to 30 of these standing trees with fish in them, or 20 to 30 brush piles with fish in them. And you also need to make sure that you're rotating them a lot. It seemed like there were these little windows where these fish would get aggressive, and if you're not there at the perfect time of day, whether that's the morning, the afternoon, whatever time it is, those fish are just not going to be super aggressive. Another thing you could try is maybe put some different baits on, and actually was experimenting with a lot of different stuff. In addition to the Vision 110 +2, I was throwing the regular Vision 110 +1 jerkbait, the standard Vision 110 from Megabass. I was throwing a little Megabass Spark Shad on a swim bait to see if I could get him to react to that little swim bait. No dice on that. I also threw a drop shot with a little robo worm on it. They wouldn't touch the drop shot. And I also went to a Neko rig. I made a video a couple weeks ago where I was catching fish out of standing timber on another lake on the Neko rig, and it worked great. But today they just wouldn't touch it. For whatever reason, the Neko rig lost all of its magic out here on Table Rock, and I wasn't able to get him to bite that thing. The only thing I could get him to commit to was this exact jerkbait right here, this Vision 110 +2. Again, I was throwing that 10-pound Sunline fluorocarbon. I was throwing an old discontinued Quantum rod. It's a 7-foot medium light action rod. But the other jerkbait rod that I use that actually you can buy is this Denali rod, which is a 6/8 medium heavy. The reason I'm using this rod is just because I don't have all of the Denali rods in yet that I ordered. There's a few that got back ordered. But if you guys want to check out Denali rods, they're sponsoring the channel now, and we actually have a discount code with Denali. You can go to denalirods.com and use the promo code FTM2022. It's all caps, FTM 2022. You get 30% off on checkout at denalirods.com. So definitely use that promo code if you want to check out some really nice rods. This is a great jerkbait rod, this AttaX series 6/8 medium heavy moderate. So definitely check that out if you're interested. Now the other cover I mentioned at the top of the video are brush piles. Not every lake in the country has standing timber, and if your lake doesn't, a lot of times it will have brush piles. Now brush piles are kind of the opposite of standing timber in the fact that they're a lot harder to find, but there's also fewer brush piles on your lake. Here, there's standing timber everywhere on Table Rock or Lake Fork, so you have to weed through which timber is productive. But a lot of times if you can find brush piles on your lake and there's no standing timber, you're usually going to have fish in those piles if they're in the right depth range. And that's really the key with brush pile fishing, guys. When you find fish in brush piles like this image here on down imaging or on side imaging, usually all of those fish are going to be in the exact same depth range. They'll be in maybe 15-foot brush piles across an entire section of the lake. And if you're fishing brush piles in 20 foot, they won't be there, or brush piles in 10 foot, they won't be there. And they can shift and change based on the conditions and stuff like that. The same thing goes for the standing timber. All the fish we caught on standing timber today were suspended 8 feet in trees that were in 20 to 25 feet of water. I couldn't get bit out of trees that were shallower or deeper than that. And a lot of times finding that right depth zone, that perfect zone where those fish are setting up, is key for finding a consistent bite across your lake. And this is how a lot of these tournaments are being won, guys. A lot of these guys are graphing with their side imaging, down imaging, or using live scope, identifying fish that are suspended in brush piles and standing timber, and they're catching some really big ones. It's a great pattern whenever that water temperature is below 55 degrees, and it's definitely something you should give a try if you have those conditions on your lake sometime this year. So that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully you learned something about how to throw a suspending jerkbait in the standing timber and brush piles using that forward-facing sonar. I'm gonna keep experimenting with new baits, new retrieves, new techniques, stuff like that, to help give you guys a better idea of how to maximize fish in this type of cover. And hopefully you guys will stay tuned to check out more videos. Make sure to subscribe to Fish the Moment so you don't miss our next upload, and leave a like on the video. It helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for checking out this one. We'll see you on the next one.